In this lecture and the lectures that follow, we're going to be creating some, for lack of a better term, hello world applications with some of those modules that we mentioned earlier. But since we're just wrapping up here and these modules aren't necessarily going to provide value to our existing application, we're going to leave our code base as it is and then just create a separate folder where you can run these examples on their own in a standalone way. So I'm going to create a new directory and call it miscellaneous, MISC. Within the miscellaneous folder, the first thing that we're going to demo is HTTP2 module. The primary thing that HTTP2 is able to accomplish out of the box is streaming WebSockets, which is something you'd have to implement manually in earlier versions of HTTP, but in HTTP2, that's just a built-in part of the protocol. And so we are going to create an HTTP2 client and an HTTP2 server and show how they can interact. So within MISC, I am going to create touch miscellaneous HTTP2 client.js and touch miscellaneous HTTP2 server.js. Let's start by creating the server. So I'm going to open up these files and I'm just going to add a comment at the top. Example HTTP2 server. As you can imagine, this is only going to have one dependency, HTTP2, because that's the only thing we need to demo here. And that's going to be require HTTP2. The first thing that we would need to do is initialize the server. So init the server. And we're going to say var server equals http2.create server. And that's just a function that you call on its own. Just like the other servers that we've created in this lecture, we need to give the server some behavior that happens when events occur, and then tell it to start listening. So the behavior that we want to configure is that on a stream, this is what I was referring to as a WebSocket earlier, but they refer to as a stream, we want to send back some hello world HTML. So when someone connects on a stream, we want to send this payload in response. So we want to call server on stream and then provide a callback where we're expecting back the stream and the headers. Now that we are within the function that's going to get called when a new stream gets connected, we can configure what the response should be. So we should say stream.respond. The status we're responding with is 200, and the content type is going to be text HTML. Then we want to end the stream, so stream end, and we'll end it by providing the HTML text payload that we want the user to see in the browser or whatever the client is. So I'm going to have an HTML opening and closing tag. Within there, I'm just going to put a body opening and closing tag. And within the body, I'm going to put a paragraph. And inside that paragraph, I'm going to say hello world. So in response to any of these new stream connections, we're going to write 200 status code. We're going to tell them that it's text HTML, and we're going to give them this HTML. Now we need to tell the server to listen on, we'll just pick a port, we'll say port 6000. So we're going to call server.listen 6000. So that's a pretty simple HTTP server that responds with some HTML. Now let's create a client that can interact with this server. I'm just going to note that this is an example HTTP2 client. And again, this is going to have one dependency, HTTP2 equals require HTTP2. To create an HTTP connection as if we were a browser or some other kind of client, we want to create a client by calling var client is equal to http2.connect, and then we'll need to specify the URL that we want to connect to. In our case, that's going to be localhost 6000, because that's the server and the port that we've configured this server to listen on. Now let's create the request. if you remember from creating HTTP requests earlier in this series, you always have to have some kind of configuration there to tell it what to do. This is no exception, so we're going to call that the request is client.request, and then pass it this configuration object. What we need to configure is that the path, which is going to be specified with a colon first, so colon path is going to be / because we're just requesting the base directory. Now we want to tell it that when a message is received, add the pieces of it together until you reach the end. So if you remember parsing HTTP payloads from incoming requests when we were building the API, data that's coming in is going to stream in. HTTP2 is no different, and in fact, HTTP2 is enforcing this kind of streaming thing. Previously, when we were creating HTTP servers, we were thinking of the client as something that sent a payload and the server as something that received a payload. Remember, now we are configuring the client. We are telling the client to stream in data from the server. That is because HTTP2, like WebSockets, opens up a full duplex connection where both client and server can send data back and forth to each other in these open streams. So we need to allow the client to read in payloads from the server just as we would have the server do from the client. So we're going to say that the request on data is going to expect a chunk to come in, and it's going to need to start assembling those chunks into a coherent string. So we're going to start by saying string is empty, and then as these chunks come in, we append them to the end of this string. Then, when the message ends, log it out. So we want to say that on end, so when we know we've reached the end of the message, we can stop assembling this string and just log out the results. Lastly, for this request to actually fire, we need to do what they call end the request, so call rec end. Now let's go back to the terminal, and this time I'm going to create two separate tabs so that you can see both the client and the server in action. In this first tab, I'm going to start up the HTTP2 server. So I'm going to call node misc/HTTP2 server.js. As you can see, we get an experimental warning that the HTTP2 module is experimental. But now we can go to our client and call node misc HTTP2 client.js. And as soon as I call this client should run through and make a connection to that server. All right, so we can see that the client received back this payload from the server. The server, we don't have anything logged out because we didn't send any payload from the client. This HTML, as you can see, is the exact same HTML that we told it to send out here. So if this client was a web browser or something, it could make this connection to this server, open up the stream, receive this body coming down the stream, and then render this web page for the user. So that is a brief overview of HTTP2, HTTP2 streams, and how you can use Node to create both an HTTP2 server or an HTTP2 client if you wish. So now let's move on to the next lecture.